We're going to be starting with a forum on the role of leadership, and I know this is a topic that we all consider every day, so I'm looking forward to a lot of questions. There will be time for questions at the end. To introduce the panelists and guide our conversation is the moderator for this session, Dr. Elizabeth Hutchinson, University of New Mexico Professor of History and the Director of the Feminist Research Institute. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. Indeed, I am Dr. Liz Hutchison, professor in history, not very capable with technology. Just learning the ropes here, and I welcome my panelists exploring how the microphones are going to work for them as well. Welcome, everyone. We're really happy to see everyone here in the land of enchantment on our sacred lands. And I'm honored to be moderating this morning's panel on leadership. I'm sad we have lost a panelist on the way to the stage due to illness. Dr. Barbara Rodriguez, our wonderful Senior Vice Provost, will not be joining us. She sends her regrets, and she sent us her notes, so we're ready. Dr. Hillman described in detail the NASEM report recommendations, and I think it's worth noting that this panel takes up all of those, especially the first, integrate values, and the fourth, improve transparency and accountability. As you know, just about every mechanism for transforming our institution's response to sexual assault and to sexual harassment relies in some measure on having committed and clear leadership, from the highest levels of administration to the daily work of building safer communities. And I know a lot of our folks working with students, staff, and faculty on these matters are here, and I thank them particularly for their work. Leading us in this discussion is one of UNM's administrative leaders most engaged in this work, and she is joined by two military officers who played critical roles in the educational mission of the military. In preparation for this panel, just before I introduce them, the panelists were asked to consider what values motivate their leadership, as well as what challenges and successes they have faced in their quest to improve their institution's response to sexual assault and harassment. After I introduce them and they address a few questions, we will turn in the last 10 to 15 minutes to audience comments and questions. To my right is Dr. Amy Levi, who serves as the Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs at UNM's Health Sciences Center, where she also holds a faculty appointment as the Leah Albers Endowed Professor of Midwifery in the College of Nursing. Dr. Levi received her master's and doctorate in nursing from the University of Pennsylvania, and before coming to UNM in 2012, engaged in full-scope midwifery practice, research, and teaching at the universities of Pennsylvania, Vermont, and California, San Francisco. We're glad she chose to come on over to New Mexico. Then to her right is Lieutenant General J. Silveria, Superintendent of the United States Air Force Academy. Before taking command of the Academy in 2017, he served as Commander and Vice Commander of Air Force bases in Nevada and California, and as the Deputy Commander of U.S. Air Force's Central Command, where he supervised operations in Central and Southwest Asia. Last but not least, on the far end, Mr. John Kroger is the first Chief Learning Officer of the U.S. Navy, having enlisted in the Marines at age 17 before earning degrees in philosophy from Yale University and his JD from Harvard Law School. Prior to his Navy position, Mr. Kroger served as a federal prosecutor, Attorney General for the state of Oregon, and President of Reed College. Welcome, everyone, and let's get started. Dr. Levi. University administration at UNM, as across the country, requires people in positions of authority like yourself to respond to all kinds of campus misconduct. What are the values and goals that you believe are most important for university leaders to bring to their work?
Well, I can't speak without acknowledging I can't speak to this without acknowledging the work of the Action Collaborative and the degree to which having so many leaders inform the work of the Action Collaborative and sharing that with the rest of us who are in leadership roles. I think the two greatest items that Dr. Hillman mentioned, but I think also motivate a lot of my work in this area, are related to transparency and accountability. And I think the challenge of that in an environment in which that has not always been evident is part of what we work on a day-to-day basis. As the president mentioned, the University of New Mexico has recently ended an agreement with the Department of Justice, and I think one of the goals of the university going forward is to be able to continue that work and to incorporate greater transparency and accountability. And one of the things that we need in order to do that is engagement from everybody from the ground up, that this is not just the leadership's responsibility, but I think also something that requires us to have the relationships and to build the capacity for being able to continue with both of those things in mind. I think here we've had an incredible opportunity both with the leadership of the president, with our engagement with the Action Collaborative from the National Academies, and I think also, we've been very fortunate to receive an Office of Violence Against Women grant that has allowed us to engage a lot of members of the university community, particularly from the OEO office, from our Women's Resource Center. Several of those people are in the audience today, and I think the development of these coordinated community response teams, opportunities for not just faculty, but also staff and students to become involved in being able to respond to what is really the responsibility of the university for identifying sexual harassment and sexual misconduct, and also I think for devising ways for us to be able to do that both at the level of victims/targets and respondents. And this is a new undertaking in this environment. I think we were very focused on, we need to train everybody, we need to give everybody education. And I think restoring an environment of civility is really the topmost responsibility, and that's something we all share. That's just not leadership's responsibility.
Well, I have a follow-up to that, which I think is probably shared by many in the room who have administrative responsibility, which is how do you do that? Can you give us some examples from your tenure as Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs that tell us some concrete ways that you think or you have sought to operationalize these values and these objectives?
Well, raising visibility, I think, has been huge. I think even with the Department of Justice situation, I think there are lots of folks on campus for whom that's just not in their viewfinder. And bringing particularly the civility piece and the culture change required to reinforce the behaviors that make that harassment intolerable, I think is a huge undertaking. But at the same time, a really necessary one. So engaging in communication, providing opportunities for education, learning, and listening. I really appreciated that Dr. Hillman pointed out that when we witness something, we need to be able to react to it in a way that's restorative. And that's not something we all do naturally. And I think learning how to listen and be willing to witness are two really important aspects of this work.
And I'm going to give you one more follow-up here, which is also a follow-up on Dr. Hillman's presentation, is whether there's any leadership or research coming out of the Action Collaborative project that you think really gives us tools or provides a way forward, or how is the Action Collaborative shaping our approach to this, operationalizing this at UNM?
Well, we're here today, and that's largely due to our engagement with the Action Collaborative. I have to say that there have been a variety of research opportunities that were started partially under your leadership, Dr. Hutchison, as the organizer of a faculty safe group, so faculty who are responding to the Department of Justice requirements that were very focused on students and undertaking the role of faculty in being able to start to monitor activities, starting to collect data, particularly related to the student educational processes that we engaged in here. So I think we're building a foundation here at UNM with our role in the Action Collaborative, with the engagement through the community, coordinated community response teams that will, I think of it as managing up from the bottom. Of course, we have amazing support from the leadership, but I think there are a lot of people in between who might have missed those messages.
Thank you. Turning now to Mr. Kroger. As the Navy's first Chief Learning Officer, you're building an office and initiatives from the ground up, I've recently learned. Does sexual assault prevention and response require a different approach than leadership on other matters? And what do you see as some of the biggest levers for change?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. So I do think leadership in this area has to look a little bit differently than leadership in other areas, and I'll give you...
Just put it to your...
Oh, sorry about that. I'll give you a couple examples of leadership areas where I think the approach needs to be a little bit different. One is that a lot of the practices we have are around data in other areas do not carry over to this area. I think it's very important to try to measure what's actually happening in our communities, but people are often very unsophisticated about how they reference data in the sexual assault and sexual harassment area. So one thing I hear quite often is our basic metric is reports or complaints, and those are going down, so we're doing a good job. And I hear this a lot. I hear this in the private sector. I hear this in the armed forces. I hear this in the academy still. And the reality, I think, is it's actually at least as likely and probably more likely that if your reports or complaints are going down, it's less a sign that you're making progress and more a sign that people do not feel comfortable coming forward with complaints and reports. So I think our basic model of, gee, if the metric is going up or down, we give ourselves a thumbs up, don't apply here. If your complaints are going up or down, that may tell you something very important what's happening, but not in a simplistic sense of, gee, we're obviously doing a good or bad job. So I would counsel leaders, particularly ones who rely on metrical benchmarks a lot, to be a little more sophisticated in their use of data in this area, and for people to make sure that they have really good anonymous survey systems in place so that you can constantly be referring back and forth between your publicly reported complaints and reports where victims are coming forth, and then what your anonymous surveys are telling you, because often you may see a really significant delta there. So I think a lot of our simple data metric interpretations need to be more sophisticated in this area than we're used to. I think the other area I would say where leadership is different, I think in a lot of areas when someone comes into a leadership position, they believe, and they're generally correct, that they start with a level of trust with the community until they lose it. That people will think, you know, you're coming into a new job, whether it's a command or a position in the academy, you're a new dean or a new vice provost. And generally people will say, yeah, I'm going to give that person the benefit of the doubt, and I know they're trying to do a great job. And you start with trust until you lose it. And I would say in this area, that is not correct. I would say almost no matter who you are, no matter what your track record may have been in another position, on the area of sexual harassment and sexual assault, you will come in with an assumption from many people in your communities that you can't be trusted on this issue, and that you have to affirmatively earn that trust. And I think that changes how you need to communicate about these issues. I would say leaders generally take issues and dump them into one or two buckets. things I want to talk about and things I don't want to talk about, but I have to talk about periodically. And you can't put sexual harassment and sexual assault into that second category of things you're going to talk about. You're not really comfortable talking about it, but you know you have to occasionally, so you do it. It has to be something that's a basic part of your communication and messaging from the very beginning. And I do think very early in one's tenure in a leadership role, you need to try to send messages that this area is important to you. Because I do think you are starting with a level of suspicion, no matter how good your track record is. And that suspicion then carries over to that data issue we just talked about, right? I think the biggest challenge we have in the system is victims do not feel comfortable coming forward for a whole host of reasons. And until we attack that more systemically, we're not going to make progress in this area. And it really is on the shoulders of, I think, leaders to try to communicate from the very beginning their awareness that that's difficult, their awareness that the system is imperfect, and try to gain and build trust so that people will come forward.
And what would you say are the biggest, in achieving those objectives, the biggest levers for change? You've talked about communication. Would you consider training, policy development, professional development part of that leadership as well?
I do think training of your staff is critical. I mean, I think I'm skeptical in a lot of ways of the idea of a best practice, but awareness of what other people are trying and how it may fit into your context, I think, is very important. I would say the biggest thing for people to do is really engage with the literature on this topic, because a lot of things may not be evident to people for whom this is not their area of expertise. An example, overwhelmingly the most dangerous period for sexual assault for traditional college-age populations is the first semester of their freshman year. And once you're aware of how often that is the period where we have tragedy, right, it changes how you think about orientation. It changes how you think about communicating with the student body in those first 2 months. It changes how you communicate with students in their second, third, and fourth year about how they are to engage with the first year class. So I think we're actually learning a tremendous amount every year as there's more and more scientific study of what is happening on the ground. And so greater awareness, I think, of that helps us identify what the levers are.
I do have one more question that I know we can do a lot of follow-up on over the day, or I hope so, because you have worked in both academic and military spheres. Do you think there are particular responses in one community that the other should use as well? And what skills do we need to develop moving forward for students, faculty, and staff? This is really a question about culture change and how this might change differently in higher ed, in university setting than in military settings.
So I guess the way I think about this, I wouldn't set up a binary between sort of military culture and then civilian culture or civilian higher education culture. I think what I would say is that lots of different types of institutional settings have problems that are unique to them. So one of the things you saw in the National Academy of Science report was a real focus on particular male-dominated areas of the academy and very institution-specific relationships between, primary investigators who have control of research funding and the graduate students they supervise. And I think what that sort of tells us is, while there may be general approaches, everyone needs to take a very context-specific look at their institutions when they're formulating what their strategies are. What will work at a small liberal arts college where 90% of the students are residential is very different from what will work at a university with 25,000 students, many of them not traditional age, many of them non-resident. So I would say generally what I would encourage And frankly, Title IX doesn't do this because Title IX really encourages us to have a one-size-fits-all response, but to really engage with the specific institutional power relationships in the context of your institutions. I think I really, having spent a lot of time working on these issues, I don't think you can lift practices from one context, put them in another, and expect to get the same results. And in the armed forces, there's a whole set of specific challenges. I would say we need a more robust discourse about what the unique challenges are in the armed forces setting. It remains a male-dominated setting in ways that are very untypical of many civilian settings. We know we've got certain cultural practices that are frankly very counterproductive. Our tradition of how sailors and Marines behave when they're in foreign ports of call, for example, does not encourage the notion that your background goal is to treat women with respect. And so, I think we really do need to interrogate some of the specific values and practices in our setting, just as you would, right, if you are, it's interesting you called out philosophy, which was my original field and love. Philosophy in the United States is notorious for having male-dominated departments with climate problems, right? Again, very specific climate that we need to address with specific practices aimed at that climate.
Well, I think there are a number of disciplines that could give philosophy a run for its money, so on that
But the philosophy one is shocking to me,
Yeah.
right? I mean, if there's a place where you're trying to talk about truth and equality and justice, that would be the place, right? I mean, it's particularly remarkable to me that that's the case.
Thank you very much. Turning now to Lieutenant General Silveria. Leaders in your position often experience pushback in response to efforts to prevent sexual assault and harassment, ranging from those who minimize the issue or are just plain tired of hearing about it. How do you think, in this context, we can build better support for these initiatives, particularly among other leaders and students, and particularly those students who are most at risk?
Well, thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today. So I think there's a couple leadership principles that apply in your question. And first off, that a leader has the responsibility of setting that tone and setting those expectations. And that the culture and the climate, I mean, Dr. Hillman pointed out, is she takes responsibility for everything. And a leader that takes responsibility for everything, in turn, I think then empowers those that work for them to see that they are also part of that problem, that they have to participate in that. So I think that leadership principle of setting the tone, setting the culture, setting the climate really applies. I do want to applaud Dr. Hillman because she brought out something that is also unique, or not unique with, as she described some faculty responses, is not unique to the faculty I have, which was that body language that comes with sometimes with faculty when you bring this up. But I also get a response sometimes with faculty and with staff, why haven't you solved this? Why are we still talking about this? So I think for our institution, one of the things that I'm constantly reminding people about, the developmental nature of the institution. And there's a unique day that we have. It's around the third week in June, and that's when 1,200 new cadets show up every June. And it's a remarkable experience to stand there and see them get out of the cars. They'll get out of a car with 2 or 3 people. Sometimes there's a minivan and there's 8 or 10 people to drop a young man or a young woman off to start their academy experience and start their career in the Air Force and now Space Force. But what's remarkable, if you think about that for a moment, is that when they get out of that car, they come with everything else that they had in their value set from what was in that car. From their parents, from their older siblings, from their grandparents. That's the values that they come to us with. And we're fooling ourselves if we think that we can spend a few minutes, days, hours, whatever, and that those values are just going to flip and become our values. So we have to take a developmental approach along the way. So as a leader, the real answer to your question is, I continue to have to provide energy to power through the idea that we have to continue to get at this issue and at this problem.
How, again, how do you decide when to implement a new intervention on a wide scale versus try something smaller and test a program's efficacy? How do you get this work done?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I think one of the pitfalls in this space, and I've experienced it through my military career, is there's such a tendency that we just want to do something. Just do something. Have a new program. I don't know what it is. I've had a long list of people who've told me, well, if you just do this or you just say that, and we certainly in the military and all of us need to resist the idea of just doing something and just starting this program. It needs to have evidence behind it. We need to have evidence-based approach to everything that we do. The real how is that we have to implement a program that we think there's something behind it. We have to take a scientific method approach to it. We have to evaluate it over time. We have to decide and be willing to assess it and through feedback and decide it's not working and decide that we need something else. We have to have an evidence-based approach. The problem with that is, and certainly if you're someone like me who answers to the United States Congress, that takes time. A new program, General, tell us on Thursday how it's going and give us a report on Monday. It takes so much more of that to work through what we really need. So the real how is that you have to stay evidence-based. And that requires a lot of institutional discipline to hang on to an evidence-based, a scientific approach to this.
Thank you very much. I want to offer an opportunity before asking more questions to any panelists who want to respond or chime in on the answers that others have given. You want to correct each other on leadership values or anything?
Yeah, clearly I need correction, sir. Can I add some about, because I broached the data point about because I wanted to follow up and support your point about the reporting numbers. Certainly, as a leader, we're in a space where one's too many, and to chase those numbers, or certainly as you describe, as we want reporting to go up, and then as the Department of Defense releases my numbers, just recently, and reporting went up, and so then I'm asked, why have your sexual assaults gone up? And that continues to be a struggle.
This is a huge problem in every area. It's not just the armed forces. The reality is right now, given the baseline level of activity, if your reports are not going up, it's probably a sign of a problem with the degree of trust that victims have coming forward. If you're seeing a radical increase in the number of people coming forward, that's probably a sign that you're doing something right, not that you're doing something wrong. And the challenge is boards of trustees don't necessarily look at that way. The public certainly doesn't look at it that way. Newspaper reporters don't look at it that way. Congress doesn't look at it that way. And so we have a general need to do much more education around this area. This was, as a liberal arts college president, this is a particular challenge because I think though we were not by any means perfect or even good, we had much higher reporting than many other institutions. And so people would ask, right, why is sexual harassment so much worse at Liberal Reed College than the University of Oregon, which has very little reporting? And right, the answer is we're creating a climate where there's trust. That's a conversation we have to have that leadership has to constantly have with the people who oversee us, our boards, if we're public institutions, our legislatures, to understand that at this stage in our history, increased reporting may correlate just as much with good performance than failure to perform.
Having just been shown some data about the Health Sciences Center on this campus, I would totally agree. It is related to trust and people's feeling that there will be no retribution, that they will not be victimized further if they come forward. But I also think we need to look at the underlying hierarchies that reinforce some of the behaviors. And I can say this from the medical hierarchy. And I agree, I resonated completely with how individuals who come onto our campus are bringing their values with them in their luggage. But at the same time, when we have institutions that have reinforced certain kinds of behaviors for maybe centuries, we really have a challenge in being able to say, we know this was okay yesterday, but it really isn't okay anymore. And we need to find ways of communicating that are meaningful to the individuals involved.
Before we go to some more general discussion, just a few open questions for any of you who'd like to respond. Mr. Kroger, you've already thrown cold water on this one, but we talk a lot about best practices. But can any of you offer one or two specific things that you've done in a campus setting or in your professional setting as leaders that you felt made a tangible difference? Maybe it'd be nice to have some examples of interventions that so far have seemed to produce more good results than bad.
I'll add one, with cautious of a best practice, but that on the reporting side, that what we've spent a lot of time doing the past few years is working on removing barriers. And some of the barriers that people felt to reporting was the misconduct that perhaps they were participating in prior to the event, prior to the unwanted contact, prior to the assault. Such as being somewhere they weren't supposed to be, being out at a time when they weren't supposed to be, drinking when they were underage, being at a location that they were not, it was against some rule to be at. We have made it very deliberate and in clear language that if you have been assaulted or a victim of a survivor of assault or unwanted contact and you come forward, then you will not be held accountable for those kind of misconduct elements. And we have survivors who have come forward who have specifically said to us, the reason I'm coming forward is because I trust you that you put out this word that because I was drinking underage and this happened to me, that I will not get in trouble for drinking underage, when before they would have held back because they were worried about reporting that they were drinking underage. So that's one thing where we have seen some tangible results.
I guess I would throw one thing that's a little bit complicated, but as a leader, one thing I did as a college president, and perhaps it's because I'm a lawyer and a litigator, is sent a message to my team that it's okay if we get sued. We are so worried about getting sued that we compromise our principles in order to avoid litigation or conflict. And a classic way in which you see this is when you have a alleged perpetrator who is found to have committed some kind of sexual assault. They will push very hard for their record to be sealed or not passed on to other institutions to which they might apply or to which they might transfer. And that is often the difference between getting sued or not sued. If you're willing to compromise on that, people will not sue you. And for me, this gets to this transparency and accountability thing. I think it is inappropriate if a student, there's got to be some point at which we forgive them for events that occurred long in the past. But I think it's inappropriate if someone has committed a serious offense at one college for us not to share that data with other institutions at which they might enroll. And so to send a message to one's team that, we're not going to throw away our principles just because someone threatens to sue us. And if it takes some money to defend what we think is right, whether it's the kind of disciplinary measure that's being handed down or the degree of transparency, it's worth supporting that in court. And I think that's very, you know, I constantly tell people, as a lawyer, there's worse things than being sued. Our goal is not to avoid litigation. Our goal is to stand up for our principles. And if someone wants to call us on that and take us to court, that's okay.
Really grateful to you for saying that in this audience. And a ray of hope in New Mexico.
And your general counsel will not agree.
I won't even go there. But a ray of hope in New Mexico is legislation that is in our legislature right now that is meeting to eliminate non-disclosure agreements in these kinds of situations. One of the things that was so remarkable at the Action Collaborative Summit was the ways in which different institutions are addressing the harasser problem. And of course, there are activists who are putting people's names on websites, and of course, the media is more than happy to engage in publicizing who these individuals might be. But at the same time, I think we do have an institutional responsibility not to allow that kind of behavior to continue. And I think reflecting on how to overcome institutional betrayal, that statements like yours are clear statements of institutional courage. And I think that is a very hard thing for us to embrace, since it's been something that is just hasn't been a part of our culture for so long. So I applaud your clarity about that, because I think it is a very important message to victims, to respondents, to anybody in the chain who is responsible for responding to allegations.
And it might, as we talk about that specific issue, lots of people are divided on the value or lack thereof of having lawyers as college and university presidents. But one way they could actually together make a difference is having all the lawyers who are institution leaders make a statement on this issue about, because we're probably better positioned to understand the value of sticking up for principles and not fearing litigation in ways that non-lawyers in the academy are not.
And I would just add that we were blown away by a lot of things at the Action Collaborative Summit this past fall, but it was particularly the presentation by the General Counsel of Michigan, if I'm not, sorry, Wisconsin, I'm not from the Midwest, who, with a mandate from their Board of Trustees, had developed a policy against passing the harasser, as it's commonly known, something that UC Davis has often done. So the signaling can come from the very top, and of course, if the university attorneys are involved, that helps the whole process move forward, following the principles that you enunciate. So thank you. Another broad question is, some advice has already gone out from this panel, but what else would you want this audience to know? If you could ask each audience member to take one action after this discussion, what would that be?
I was reaching for you.
I'll let you go first.
I guess I'll use a short story. That whenever I travel, because of my student population is made up of 435 congressional districts, whenever I travel, I always take the opportunity to meet with parents in the location where I'm at. So last night I had the privilege of meeting a lot of parents who are from the Albuquerque area, and some of them outlying, and who have cadets from all 4 years at the Air Force Academy. And I would offer to the leaders in the room that if you ever need any motivation, stand with a mom and a dad who have their 18-year-old daughter at a military institution. So what I'm getting at when I say that is that for someone to take away, let's remember all of the constituencies that are out there, and that all of those constituencies, while we are working with them for for solutions. They're also who can help us with all of those solutions. You know, I'm quick to tell someone who wants to talk about our numbers that are posted or whatever. I'm quick to ask them, well, what are you doing? What would you propose? What's on your mind? So what I would offer to those here today is that let's continue to look for the actionable results, continue to look for all of us, and it will take not just a village, it will take an enterprise for us to continue to get at this.
You summarized with the thing that popped into my head first, which is look for the pain points, because I think we all probably could identify what those are in our institutional settings, and those are going to be the hardest things to work on. But if those are being addressed, the rest of it will seem relatively easy. And we do have a lot of pain points, I think, when we have this conversation, whether it's having gotten engaged in this litigious piece or whether it has been just not being willing to engage. So I always do the hardest thing first, and the other stuff will come easily after that.
I guess the one piece of advice I would have, I think the emerging field of sexual assault prevention and response has really developed a great deal of expertise, and the professionals who work in that field, you know, many of them were pioneers in the field because it still remains a relatively young field, but the degree of expertise is remarkable. And for any leader, the amount of bandwidth you can have on this one issue as opposed to any other is always limited. So you need a quarterback, and that should be your sexual assault prevention and response officer or leader and don't force them to come to you. I think every leader needs to reach out to their sexual assault prevention officer and say affirmatively, tell me what I need to do, tell me what will help advance this work, and then don't say no. And particularly for leaders, it makes a big difference. Tell your immediate staff anything our SAPR officer asks for, we're doing. You say that, and it will set up a climate in which, you know, the sexual assault professionals won't feel bad about coming to ask for help and leadership, and you will have better guidance and awareness about what you can actually do to move the needle, as opposed to trying to figure out that for yourself.
Thank you very much. We'd like to turn now to questions and comments from the audience. We have quite a lot of leaders in this room, so I'm hoping we can get some feedback and comments, suggestions. Please identify yourself, come to the microphone, and launch the question.
So, Cole Carvor, Low Respect Advocacy Center here at UNM, and that last response is kind of a question I've been thinking about throughout this session. Several of you use this phrase, from the ground up, and given the hierarchical nature of institutions, the types of power relationships that define these issues, what are those concrete strategies and practices of leadership that demonstrate engagement and visibility without sitting in the place of knowledge or setting the agenda at the expense possibly of the survivors themselves, the faculty, the staff that work most closely with those survivors?
I think I will take a stab. Not to sound remarkably obsequious, but our Secretary of the Navy is here, and one of the things he, in most of his public presentations, talks about the value of humility. And I think humility in this area is really important. Being a leader in this area does not mean that you know everything about this area. It does not mean that you have all the answers. And so I think the way in which you can subvert some of those hierarchies is by being a convener and a listener, rather than having as your leadership model that I'm going to figure out what the right answer is and then I'm going to tell you what to do. I don't want to overgeneralize, but I do think in a lot of fields, there's an idea that what a leader means is that you're the person who knows the most, and that is not the case. And so, trying to bring that humility to this area as a leader, I think, is really important. And trust the professionals who work in this area. And it's not that you shouldn't interrogate their guidance and be a critical consumer of their recommendations, but trust your team to actually help you identify what will help.
I think, I don't know where you went, but I think for me what I would offer is that one of the things that I took on when I showed up at the Air Force Academy is that I met personally with survivors. I didn't ask them to. I made myself available. And if they wanted to meet with me, they could. Some of those meetings were 5 minutes. Some of them were an hour and a half long. And survivors want to hear that you believe them, that you care, that the institution cares. And we all know that, all of you that are in this space and working on this material. But what it told me as a leader, between that survivor and me, are a lot of layers and a lot of people, and it allowed me very much an opportunity to learn about my institution. So I've continued to do that, and I continue to learn, with that individual, personalized, touch presence with survivors. So I would offer that as a leadership, certainly hierarchical, as all institutions are. But that does not relieve the leader of the responsibility of knowing what happened when someone had their very worst day.
Hi, my name is Mala Tun. I'm here from the University of New Mexico. I think this is a terrific panel, and I agree with everything that you've all said. There's just one point in particular that I would like to push back on, and that was, I think, John Kroger, you said that the biggest challenge we have is that victims do not feel comfortable coming forward. And I think it's really important to move the focus in this discussion beyond getting victims to report, making survivors feel comfortable, improving our reporting and investigative procedures. As someone who has a lot of experience, both personal and academic, in this issue, victims have zero incentive to report and every motive never to say anything to anybody. And so I'd like to rephrase the challenge that we all face, which is that the biggest challenge is that people, members of the community, people who are witnessing an event, who hear about it, need to develop the confidence, the skills, and the support to actually intervene when they witness something, to intervene, to create a positive and supportive climate for everybody. And Sharon Potter and Jane Stapleton will be speaking more about it this afternoon, but I think that sharing the responsibility and the blame, not just responsibilizing, for lack of a better word, the victim, but distributing the responsibility across the community so that everybody is engaged as a bystander, a responsible and active bystander, that's the biggest challenge we face, not getting victims to feel comfortable reporting.
So that's a fantastic perspective. Yes, I think the bystander issue is hugely important. It may be a lot of sexual assault happens when people are isolated and they're not bystanders, and that's the only that's the only thing I would say about that challenge, is that what predators do is cull people away from everyone else, and I've seen that a lot. I mean, one of the unique things about the Reed College presidency, and it's a very unique job, is that every student conduct case comes to the president, which is unlike any other president I know. So over a period of my presidency, I saw every sexual assault case that came forward. And lots of those cases, there might have been a bystander early on who could see an interaction at a party that they might have done something to stop. And we do need to encourage that. But I think a lot on the assault side of the spectrum, It does happen when people are isolated. So I think both are, I wouldn't want to, I think your comment is very well taken. I wouldn't want to prioritize one of those challenges over the other. I think they're both very important.
Hello, my name is Steve Bishop. I'm here at the University of New Mexico as well. So I want to thank you all about talking about issues like putting primacy on the assault over other misconduct, or recognizing that one needs to affirmatively earn trust and so forth. These are all statements that you've all made about that recognize the importance of a survivor-centered approach. Meaning, amongst other things, that survivors can control to the best degree possible their process and their narrative. So my question is, how do you balance ideas of leadership, of taking control of the situation, while at the same time allowing survivors to lead, so to speak, their own process and their own narrative?
I think it's incredibly complex for all the reasons that we just talked about, why survivors don't want to come forward and all of that. And so part of that is creating an environment in which they can feel empowered, knowing that there are safe zones, if you will, safe individuals to whom they can report and confide in. I think particularly in this era of mandatory reporters, the idea that you can disclose to someone and not have to fear being pulled into a process that is not really going to protect you and not going to allow you to have that control is really important to address. And we have a lot of confusion about that, particularly because of the Title IX regulations, and in settings in which anyone who becomes aware of an incident is then required to report it up the chain. So we need to have safe spaces. We need to have confidential advocacy centers and places that victims / support or survivors, targets can go so that they can regain that power and that sense of responsibility. And it's a really fine line and a really important dance for us to support, especially in leadership roles when we can't control things like the litigious nature of some of the individuals who are involved, or at this point in time, the Title IX regulations. If there's an expectation of due process, how do we allow a victim / survivor to have control over a process in which they are not going to have access to the kind of support they're going to need?
I'd offer that one of the ways that the military has approached this problem for survivors is a concept that's directed for all of the cases to be managed individually in a case management group that we meet once a month, and we go over each individual case. But in that context, we go over each individual case with their commander, with the mental health counseling center available, with the law enforcement available. I chair the meeting so that we can continue as an institution to review that individual case. We actually published an article inside Higher Ed from the Air Force Academy about how we do that. One of the main authors is here, one of my attorneys, but I'd offer that is a way that we try to balance so that we have the law enforcement view, we have the attorneys in the room, we have their attorneys, my attorney, someone that represents the survivors, so that we can continue to get a complete picture about ultimately taking care of the survivor.
I think we have to recognize there are times when the institution's goals and interests may conflict with the victim's interests, and having a robust victim support and advocacy service, whether it's internal to the university or an outside service that's provided, so that the victim really has someone they can talk to about how to maintain that control. because it is correct that once they're reporting to mandatory reporters, there's a whole cascading set of effects that they can no longer control, and most victims are unaware of that. And so to have victims advocates who really are there for the victim and not and want to help the victim protect their rights and goals and interests and their healing process is I think essential.
Hi, my name is Molly Weiser. I am my pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a white presenting queer Latina Southwesterner from Ohio, who is the Title IX coordinator at Fort Lewis College, 4 hours north of here. And I just wanted to name the tension between building the trust necessary to receive those reports and ever becoming a person who might sit on a platform like the ones you are sitting on now. And the challenge to leadership that I am laying out here of holding space for the wild and unsanitary conversations about sex, vaginas and penises and vulvas and clitorises and lube and things that need to occur that are risky to have but are essential to preventing sexual assault. I don't know. I've been Title IX coordinator for about 6 years, and in the last, which is a grandmother of Title IX coordination, I believe, and in the last couple of years, I've just let go and thought, well, it's been a good ride, and I can always practice law, even in Durango, and we're going to talk about sex, and I'm going to become a little hard to stand next to at this college if you want to hold on to your job. And I just challenge y'all to hold space for me and for everybody else out here who's taken the chances to talk with people about the tough and pleasurable things, all about sex. Thank you.
The 56-year-old white, gray-haired, balding white guy will go right at that. And one of the things that we've done directly and specifically at what you're talking about is actually a point of pride that we've developed at the Air Force Academy. We refer to it as healthy relationship training. And so I've sat through a lot of it. It is decidedly uncomfortable, direct, and specific for me to sit through it. And the reason that and we still have a lot of data to gather on it, as I mentioned before about evidence-based. The reason that we have, that I think it has been successful, and we're continuing to put more resources onto it, we're continuing to develop curriculum. A lot of other universities are picking up the material. I have somebody here with me who is someone who teaches the material. The idea is that so much of the material that we've done in the past is what not to do. Don't harass, don't assault, don't do this, this is the wrong behavior. It's a laundry list of the things not to do. This focuses on what is a healthy relationship between two people look like. What to do. And so it focuses on building that. The feedback that we're getting in the surveys is that exceptional, and not only is the material good, the feedback we're getting is that it's changing behavior. And the idea is teaching them what to do, as opposed to us continuing to arguably bark at them about what not to do. This is to tell them what to do.
We have just about 2 minutes, and I would like to invite you to make your question. Go ahead.
I'm Commodore Rebecca Patterson, and obviously I come from the Canadian Armed Forces. So my role is equivalent to what Rear Admiral Burkhardt would do with SAPR. And I'm a Director General, but I've often called myself the DG Unpleasant and Awkward Conversations, which I find is a good icebreaker. What I'd actually like to do is come back to your comment when you talk about that pull between what's expected of us on the outside, whether it be through Congress, through the media, through our survivors, and why haven't you fixed this? Why hasn't it changed now? Versus when we look into our institutions and the struggle as leaders, senior leaders trying to say, stay the course, this takes time. Culture change takes time. But we also know that it's absolutely critical that we maintain the momentum with leaders that we work with, whether it be academic or military leaders. And I'm just very curious as to what sort of advice or approaches that you're thinking of. How do we get those at the coalface dealing with people on a daily basis to stay the course, maintain the conversation and the dialogue? What have you been doing? It's kind of like being on a diet and falling off the wagon when you don't see the results you want.
I would say in a higher education setting, I think it's really important for the president and the provost and the dean of students to be having a constant conversation with their board, rather than waiting for an incident which provokes media attention and then you're having a sort of defensive session with your board. Lots of institutions have institutional dashboards. If sexual harassment or sexual assault data involving both staff and faculty and students are not on that dashboard, I would question why they are not. I think it's very helpful to normalize that data as something the board periodically reviews and has a conversation with outside of a crisis environment. And that gives an opportunity then for the president or the chancellor and their senior staff to be having a conversation with their board about the reality of what this data shows and does not show, and how it relates to efforts on campus. I think the conversations in a governmental setting are in a lot of ways more challenging, because there you're in front of a committee of Congress, and the thing I would say is that if we honestly believe in the narrative we are presenting, and it is an honest and truthful one, I think people will find that compelling and respectful. If we appear that we are, you can't, when the data shows one thing, you can't go and declare victory, and then when the data goes in the other direction, say, we're still doing really well, but the data is going in the other direction, but we're still doing just as good. You really need to be, even when your data supposedly looks good, you need to be having an honest conversation about the fact that things are very imperfect, that the reporting data may not support the narrative that's most attractive, and be having an honest and ongoing educational conversation with those oversight authorities. But it's a great challenge.
I will say that in my words sometimes I will say things that we need time to evaluate a program, but I will never say, stay the course, we've got this, we're taking, because back to my previous comment, that whatever I have done is hopefully making a difference and hopefully changing a culture, and is interesting in a lot of ways. And on June 26, 1,200 people show up. I haven't met them. I know them to a certain amount. I know them to a degree. I hope I've screened them well, but I don't know what truly is their value set when they've been challenged and they're away from home. So I do think that we have to continue the conversation both about evidence-based programs that do take time to evaluate, but I would never, as a leader, abrogate my responsibility that I'm still responsible on that day in June when that person shows up, to protect them, to provide them the resources, and to continue to develop them and educate them. But I will have total empathy with the idea that, there still is an expectation that, I want to know how it's going on Thursday and I want the report on Monday. And that it's a bureaucracy, and we will have to continue to work with that. And I will fall back on one of Dr. Hillman's points on the solutions, that number one was to continue to remain values-based.
All right. I need to interrupt just because
No,
we do
I'm
want to
getting
include
cut
one
off.
more question. Excuse me. Please go ahead.
Thank you, and I know you don't have time to answer, but just still want to ask Brandy Stone, Director of African American Student Services. As in leadership roles, I'm just curious, what best practices or support are you providing to those on the ground that are intaking as mandatory reporters consistently, so that we're not burning out or we're not losing trust in the system, and what self-care are you providing to those staff that are constantly in those roles? So thank you.
Just acknowledging the issue, I think, is the first step. Knowing that there is some kind of secondary trauma that can occur. We actually had a conversation about this last night, I think, in terms of how mandatory reporters all the way to advocates really need to emphasize self-care in everything that they do. I think just acknowledging that being engaged in this is very challenging for people. So providing the support systems that will support the individuals who do this work is of utmost importance.
I think with that, we are out of time. I thank you all for your attention. I thank the panelists.